Pride and Prejudice. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet of Longbourn had 5 daughters. Jane was kind and beautiful, Elizabeth was loyal and clever, Mary was studious, Kitty was silly, and Lydia was mischievous. Mrs. Bennet so wanted her girls to be married, she could think of nothing else. One summer's day, 2 gentlemen rode into town. Mr. Bingley was very rich, Mr. Darcy was richer still. Mrs. Bennet thought they would be a perfect match for Elizabeth and Jane. One night there was a ball in town. All the ladies of the neighborhood were invited. Mr. Bingley could not take his eyes off Jane. He danced with her all night. But Mr. Darcy was very rude and would not dance with Elizabeth. "Come, Darcy, I must have you dance." "I certainly shall not." One day Jane and Elizabeth came to dinner at Mr. Bingley's house. Mr. Bingley seemed to be falling in love with Jane. Mr. Darcy was less friendly, but he began to notice Elizabeth's very fine eyes. Mr. Bingley's sister was jealous of Elizabeth. Her hair so untidy, and her petticoats 6 inches deep in mud. A Mr. Collins came to stay with the Bennets. He asked Elizabeth to be his wife. Elizabeth refused. She did not love him. "You could not make me happy, and I am convinced I am the last woman in the world who could make you so." Later, Elizabeth found out that Mr. Collins had proposed to her friend Charlotte. Engaged to Mr. Collins? My dear Charlotte, impossible! Worse news came from Mr. Bingley. He sent Jane a letter saying he was moving away to London forever. Life returned to normal for the Bennet girls. They sewed and read and went out dancing in their prettiest dresses. One night Elizabeth met a charming soldier named Mr. Wickham. He said Mr. Darcy was proud and cruel. Elizabeth believed him. Spring came. Elizabeth went to visit Charlotte and Mr. Collins. They were asked to dinner with a grand lady called Catherine de Bourgh. Lady Catherine's nephew arrived. It was Mr. Darcy. After that, Elizabeth found herself bumping into him everywhere she went. One evening, Mr. Darcy came to visit Elizabeth. He told her that he had tried not to fall in love with her because her family was not very elegant and her younger sisters had bad manners. He had even warned Mr. Bingley not to marry Jane. "You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you." Elizabeth was angry. She could never marry someone who had made her sister unhappy. "I had not known you a month before I felt that you were the last man in the world whom I could ever be prevailed upon to marry." Elizabeth told Mr. Darcy that Mr. Wickham had warned her that he was cruel. Mr. Darcy left. The next morning Elizabeth received a letter. It was from Mr. Darcy. He explained that he had been worried that Jane didn't really love Mr. Bingley. He said that Mr. Wickham was not an honest man. Mr. Wickham had once pretended to be in love with Mr. Darcy's sister. Elizabeth felt very confused. Was Mr. Darcy cruel, or was Mr. Wickham the villain? Months passed. Elizabeth went traveling with her aunt and uncle. They looked around a stately home called Pemberley. It was Mr. Darcy's house. Suddenly, Mr. Darcy arrived home. He invited Elizabeth to meet his sister. Elizabeth was beginning to like Mr. Darcy, but then she received another letter. The letter was from Jane. She said that Mr. Wickham was indeed a bad man. He had met Lydia Bennet at a ball and had persuaded her to run away. Now the pair were missing in London. Elizabeth left for home at once. Now Mr. Darcy would think worse of her family than ever. He might never speak to her again. At Longbourn, Mrs. Bennet was very upset. Jane and Elizabeth tried to keep everyone calm while they waited for some news. Mr. Bennet told Kitty and Mary they would never be allowed to go to balls again, in case they ran away too. At last word came that Lydia and Mr. Wickham had been found. Mr. Darcy had discovered them. He had even given Mr. Wickham money so that he would marry Lydia and not embarrass the Bennet family. Mr. Darcy had done all of these things because he loved Elizabeth. "Your family owes me nothing. Much as I respect them, I thought only of you." Mr. and Mrs. Bennet of Longbourn had 5 daughters. Mary was just as studious, Kitty was slightly less silly, and Lydia, now Mrs. Wickham, was still mischievous. But Jane became Mrs. Bingley, and Elizabeth married her Mr. Darcy. Good night.